Hey guys, today we step back to the time when the Earth was on the brink of transformation. Imagine standing on the icy edge of the world, surrounded by towering glaciers, the air so cold it bites into your skin. This is the Great Ice Melt, a time when the world is warming and everything familiar is being torn apart, piece by piece. The ice is beginning to recede, and the frozen landscapes you've known for millennia are slowly giving way to a new, unfamiliar world. You can hear the slow, deep groans of the glaciers as they pull away, retreating from the vast land they once claimed. You probably won't survive this if you don't adjust quickly to the changing world around you. This isn't just about survival, it's about adapting to a whole new way of life. As the glaciers shrink and melt, everything begins to change. The plants, the animals, the weather, each of them behaves differently, and you're left trying to keep up with a world that seems to be shifting faster than you can understand. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Great Ice Melt wasn't just a slow thaw. It was a violent, unpredictable event that forced humanity to rethink everything. For the first time, humans would face a world where nothing stayed the same. The ancient landscapes of ice and tundra were giving way to grasslands and forests, and with that change came new risks, new challenges, and new opportunities. But how did humans survive such a drastic shift in the environment? Let's explore what life was like when the world started to thaw, and how prehistoric people faced these enormous changes. As the ice begins to recede, you feel the first wave of heat in the air. It's subtle at first, a warmth that wasn't there before, like a long-forgotten sun finally starting to break through the chill. But it's not just the air that's changing. The entire landscape is transforming before your eyes. What was once a vast, frozen tundra is now showing signs of life, grasslands stretching where ice fields once ruled, rivers swelling with the melted waters from the retreating glaciers. The land is waking up, and so too must you. Historians still argue whether this change was gradual or a sudden, catastrophic shift in climate. Some believe that the world warmed slowly over thousands of years, while others suggest that the Great Ice Melt was a rapid event, a dramatic moment in Earth's history that took the world by surprise. Either way, the effects were far-reaching. As the ice receded, it revealed a much more temperate climate, which eventually gave birth to new ecosystems. The change wasn't just temperature, it was a complete reconfiguration of the environment. The animals that once roamed the tundra, woolly mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths, began to migrate, adapt, or face extinction. In their place, new species began to appear, like the bison and early horses, who could withstand the warmer, more dynamic environment. And it's not just the animals that are affected. The plants that once dominated the frozen landscape, the low-lying shrubs and hardy grasses, are being replaced by larger trees and thicker vegetation. The land is becoming richer, more diverse, but it's also unfamiliar. The vegetation shifts from icy grasses to robust trees, and the change presents a dilemma for early humans. What does this new landscape mean for your survival? How do you find food when the familiar resources you've relied on, mammoths, large game, are no longer abundant? The change is not just biological, it's a mental and cultural challenge as well. It's a time of uncertainty where people must adapt quickly, or they risk becoming relics of the past. And adaptation doesn't just mean learning new hunting techniques or finding new food sources. It means adjusting to a different pace of life. In the cold, you had all the time in the world. You huddled together for warmth, you survived as a group, and you lived off what the frozen world offered you. But in this new world of warmer temperatures and abundant life, things move faster. The growing season is shorter, the food is more plentiful but harder to track, and the threats, animals, and weather are no longer predictable. For humans, the world is shifting beneath their feet, and in this new reality, everything must change. The pace of life is about to pick up. And so, you and your group must start to consider your options. The hunting and gathering practices that served you well in the frozen tundra may not be enough here. You can't rely solely on the mammoth herds that once roamed freely. They're now migrating away as the climate shifts. The landscape is no longer dominated by icy winds, but by unpredictable weather patterns, thunderstorms, floods, and even droughts. The world is offering more, but at the same time, it demands more. It's not enough to just survive in this new world. You must learn how to thrive. And that means embracing change, developing new tools, and adapting to the climate and animals that are now part of your environment. The key to survival won't just be about strength or hunting skills. It will be about flexibility, innovation, and the ability to read and understand the world around you. The transition from an ice-covered world to a more temperate one presents a challenge for every aspect of survival. As you move deeper into the shifting landscape, you realize that your traditional hunting methods and familiar food sources are no longer viable. The great herds of mammoths, which once grazed the icy plains, are migrating, retreating from the changing environment. Some of them are driven south, searching for cooler habitats, while others are simply too slow to adapt and begin to disappear. The land is no longer abundant with large, easy-to-capture game. Now, you must learn to adapt to new, faster-moving creatures that aren't as easy to catch. Historians still argue whether this dramatic shift was felt immediately or if it took centuries for human populations to realize the extent of the change. Some anthropologists suggest that early humans were initially able to rely on their old hunting grounds and the animals they knew well, using their sharp instincts and knowledge of the land to survive. Others argue that the massive changes in climate and animal migrations forced a quicker adaptation, pushing humans to diversify their diets and hunting methods far more rapidly than anticipated. Either way, the need for change was immediate and undeniable. One of the first major shifts was in hunting tactics. The large, slow-moving mammoths were replaced by faster, more elusive prey, such as bison, wild horses, and even smaller mammals like rabbits and rodents. These animals were harder to track, quicker to escape, and much more unpredictable. As a result, the prehistoric people began to adapt their hunting strategies. The once communal hunts that involved large groups of people taking down a single massive mammoth shifted towards smaller, more tactical group hunts. Humans became more dependent on their agility and coordination, learning to work together in smaller teams to trap and bring down more nimble prey. Tools were modified as well. Spears became lighter, and hunting weapons were designed to be thrown from further distances. The use of bows and arrows might have begun around this time, allowing for greater precision and a less dangerous approach to bringing down smaller, faster animals. But it wasn't just hunting methods that needed to change. Food sources were now more diverse, requiring new methods of gathering and processing. In addition to the usual berries, roots, and tubers, humans began to explore more varied plant life. The warming climate brought with it new kinds of edible vegetation, wild grains, plants that could be cooked into stews, and even early forms of fruit that had never before flourished in the colder temperatures. Some tribes began to experiment with the domestication of animals, like dogs and, much later, goats and sheep, which would eventually become a cornerstone of future agricultural societies. Yet, while the earth was changing and new food sources were becoming more abundant, there were still hazards to navigate. With the shifting climate came the unpredictability of the weather, intense storms, unexpected floods, and long periods of drought. Prehistoric people had to learn how to manage the new environment. While shelter inside caves and tents made of animal skins offered protection from the elements, the unpredictable weather required new strategies for gathering food and storing it. The presence of new dangers, like predators that were more suited to warmer climates, also became a concern. Large, powerful carnivores like cave lions, saber-toothed tigers, and hyenas that once roamed the frozen lands were increasingly replaced by more aggressive, territorial species like wolves and bears. These creatures began to move into the warmer, more abundant areas, preying on smaller mammals, and sometimes even on early humans. Early humans began to adapt by creating more effective weapons and fortifying their shelters with stronger materials, learning how to coexist with or fend off these predators. Survival in the midst of such extreme environmental shifts was no small feat, but it was a testament to the adaptability of prehistoric humans. While the world outside was changing rapidly, these early people found ways to not only survive but thrive in the evolving landscapes. It wasn't just about hunting. It was about understanding the environment in new ways and becoming flexible in how they lived, ate, and protected themselves. The adaptability of early humans during this time would lay the foundation for the next stages of human progress. The question now is, how did these shifts in diet and hunting practices affect the social dynamics within these early communities? How did humans adjust not just their tools, but their social structures to keep up with the ever-changing world around them? As the great ice melt reshaped the environment, it didn't just alter the animals, plants, and weather, it also forced early humans to rethink how they interacted with each other. The need to adapt quickly meant that social structures had to shift as well. In a world where survival wasn't guaranteed and resources were becoming more scattered, cooperation became paramount. The traditional roles within prehistoric communities were tested, and new ones emerged to meet the challenges posed by a rapidly warming world. Historically, there's been a debate among anthropologists about the exact structure of early human societies. Some argue that early humans lived in small, egalitarian groups where everyone participated in the hunt, shared responsibilities equally, and decisions were made collectively. Others suggest that, as resources became more difficult to access, society might have started to develop more hierarchical structures, with individuals or families taking on specific roles like leadership or specialized tasks. Regardless of the exact model, what is clear is that survival in the post-Ice Age world required a more coordinated and organized approach. One of the most significant changes would have been in the way groups organized their hunts. The community, once united in the hunt for massive mammoths, now had to face the challenge of tracking faster, more elusive animals. Smaller hunting parties became more common, where strategic planning and precise execution were key. In a small group, each person's role was critical, whether as a scout, a trapper, or the one to make the final kill. The success of these hunts didn't just rely on the skills of the individuals. It required a level of trust and communication that went beyond anything prehistoric humans had experienced before. In this new world, hunting was no longer just an instinctual act. It was a shared, coordinated effort. But the social changes didn't stop at the hunt. The introduction of new food sources, like grains and fruits, meant that more time had to be spent gathering and preparing food. This opened up opportunities for division of labor. While some men continued to hunt, many women began to take on roles that were vital for the food supply, gathering, preparing, and preserving the foods that would sustain the group during the harsher months. This was a critical shift, as it allowed humans to store food for the future, reducing the dependence on immediate hunting and allowing for more balanced, sustainable living. As the climate warmed and new resources became available, these early humans would have needed to forge stronger social bonds, not just to share food, but to ensure protection against the now encroaching predators and rival groups. Competition for territory, especially during periods of scarcity, became a real threat. Communities had to work harder to defend their resources and maintain a steady supply of food. Early humans likely found that cooperation wasn't just a matter of preference, it was a survival strategy. The rise in competition and the need for more organized defense led to the formation of rudimentary leadership roles. This shift is evident in the archaeological record, where signs of more permanent settlements begin to emerge. Leadership in these new environments wasn't about brute strength alone, but also about strategic thinking, resource management, and the ability to foster cooperation. Leaders, whether they were shamans, hunters, or the most seasoned gatherers, became the guiding figures in these communities. Historians still debate the nature of leadership in early human groups. Some believe that leadership was more egalitarian, based on consensus, while others argue that it became increasingly hierarchical as humans faced the challenges of a changing world. What's clear, however, is that the social dynamics of these groups were evolving. As resources became more scarce and survival more uncertain, these early humans learned that their survival depended not just on individual strength, but on the strength of the community as a whole. The shift in social dynamics during the Great Ice Melt wasn't just about food. It was about adapting to the new realities of the changing world. The relationships between individuals and groups became more complex, and survival depended on the ability to forge stronger, more strategic alliances. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle. How would these humans cope with the psychological and spiritual impacts of such a massive environmental shift? As the world around them transformed, early humans were not just adapting physically to new climates and environments. They were also grappling with the psychological and spiritual consequences of such drastic changes. The Ice Age wasn't just a time of physical survival, it was also a time of profound existential reflection. The thawing of the Earth, the disappearance of familiar creatures, and the arrival of new dangers would have undoubtedly challenged the worldview of prehistoric peoples. They weren't just figuring out how to hunt new prey or gather different plants. They were confronting the very nature of life and death itself. It's likely that this existential crisis, born out of a rapidly changing world, had profound spiritual implications for prehistoric people. Many anthropologists argue that spirituality and religion emerged in part as a response to the unpredictable forces of nature. In a world where the climate could shift overnight and where large herds could disappear in the blink of an eye, humans would have sought ways to make sense of it all. They would have turned to rituals, symbols, and belief systems to help cope with the fear of change and the threat of extinction. Historians still debate the exact role of spiritual beliefs during the transition from the Ice Age to a warmer world. Some argue that early humans began to associate the changing climate with divine will, seeing the thaw as a blessing or a curse, depending on their perspective. Others suggest that the shift in the environment may have led to a more animistic view of the world, where everything, every animal, tree, and stone, was imbued with spiritual significance. The mammoth, once a central figure in both the physical and spiritual lives of humans, may have become a symbol of the old world that was slipping away. As these great creatures retreated or went extinct, early humans might have turned to the spiritual realm for answers, attempting to understand why the familiar was disappearing. There was likely an increase in ritual activity during this period, more frequent ceremonies, more offerings to the spirits, and more efforts to communicate with the forces they believed controlled the natural world. Archaeological evidence from this time suggests that there was an uptick in the creation of symbolic art, such as cave paintings and figurines. These artifacts could have served as both spiritual expressions and attempts to understand and influence the world around them. It's not just about appeasing the spirits, it's about trying to establish a connection, to ensure survival in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. But how did these early humans cope with the fear of an uncertain future, a fear amplified by the massive shifts in their environment? For some, this would have been a time of anxiety, a time when the old ways no longer worked and new solutions had to be found. For others, it may have been an opportunity for transformation, a chance to discover new ways of living, new tools for survival, and new ways to understand the forces at work in the world. As they face this shifting world, it's clear that their spirituality and their social organization began to evolve. The old ways of hunting and gathering, the familiar patterns of life that had worked for centuries, were being replaced by new methods of survival, methods that required more cooperation, more organization, and a stronger connection to the land and the spirits that governed it. This psychological shift was about more than just changing beliefs, it was about survival. The people who adapted their spiritual practices to the new world were likely the ones who fared best. Those who could not only hunt and gather, but also understand the deeper forces of nature, who could make sense of the chaos around them, were better equipped to handle the environmental challenges that came with the thaw. This deepening of spiritual practices was not a sign of weakness or superstition. It was a critical survival tool in an ever-changing world. In the face of uncertainty, spirituality gave early humans the courage to press on. They were no longer just surviving the Ice Age. They were facing the dawning of a new world, one where they would have to create new traditions and ways of thinking to thrive. They would have to rely on each other, on their adaptability, and on their ability to make sense of a world that no longer fit the patterns they once knew. As the ice continued to melt and the Earth warmed, the first humans found themselves not only battling the changing environment, but also adjusting to the rise of new challenges in their physical survival. The world was no longer just a tundra. It was becoming a place of diverse ecosystems, where forests, grasslands, and rivers flourished in ways they never had before. This new, warmer world brought with it an influx of unfamiliar plant and animal species, some of which were useful for food, others dangerous, and some entirely unpredictable. With these changes came new hunting and gathering strategies. Early humans, who had once relied on the slow-moving megafauna like mammoths and mastodons, now faced the reality that these large animals were disappearing. They were replaced by faster, smaller creatures such as bison, wild horses, and even early forms of deer and antelope. These animals didn't offer the same straightforward hunting tactics. They were quicker and more elusive, requiring new methods of tracking, trapping, and capturing. Historians still argue about how quickly early humans were able to adjust their hunting strategies. Some believe that this transition was swift, forced by the rapid extinction or migration of the larger megafauna. Others suggest that it was a gradual change, where humans adapted slowly over time as new prey was discovered. Either way, it's clear that early humans had to adapt quickly or risk starvation. To keep up with this new reality, humans became more inventive with their tools. Spears and bows likely became more refined, allowing for greater precision when hunting these faster animals. The use of traps, snares, and other ingenious devices became more widespread as they offered a way to capture game without the need for a direct confrontation. This shift also marked the beginnings of what we might recognize as early hunting communities, groups of individuals who worked together to track and corner animals, sharing the burden of the hunt in ways that required communication and cooperation. But it wasn't just the hunting techniques that changed. Early humans were becoming more strategic in how they utilized the resources of their environment. They began to expand their diet beyond just meat, embracing the plant life that the warming world provided. As the climate changed, certain edible plants and early crops began to thrive in areas where they had once been absent. Berries, grains, tubers, and early forms of wild vegetables were harvested with greater efficiency, and humans began to understand the seasonal rhythms of their environment. These resources, once just supplementary, started to play a bigger role in sustaining their communities. This shift toward a more diverse diet didn't just change what early humans ate, it also changed how they lived. Communities began to form around these new food sources. The ability to store and preserve food for the leaner months became more important, leading to the development of early storage techniques. People would have started to find ways to dry or smoke meat, store grains, and preserve plants to ensure that they had food year-round. But the environmental shift wasn't without its challenges. As the ice receded and temperatures fluctuated, weather patterns became more erratic. Prolonged droughts, storms, and floods introduced uncertainty into what had once been a more predictable world. The rivers and lakes that were once reliable for fresh water could dry up or become flooded. The changing seasons, which were once easy to predict, now shifted with increasing irregularity. Early humans had to become more resourceful in how they gathered water, sheltered themselves, and stored food, as these factors were no longer as predictable as they had been in the colder world. The Great Ice Melt brought more than just warmer temperatures, it brought unpredictability, and with it, a need for even greater adaptability. Early humans were no longer just navigating a landscape dominated by ice. They were learning to live in a world where the very seasons could turn on them, where the future was uncertain, and where the tools that had once worked might no longer suffice. Survival became not just a matter of what you could hunt, but of how well you could adapt to a world that was constantly shifting beneath your feet. As the Earth warmed and the environment transformed, one of the most crucial adaptations for prehistoric people wasn't just about what they ate or how they hunted. It was about how they lived together. The social structures that had once been effective in the icy world of the Pleistocene needed to evolve just as quickly as their hunting strategies and food sources. Survival was no longer solely about the skills of the individual. It was about how well communities could cooperate, share resources, and weather the changing conditions together. In the colder world, humans were often more dispersed, with small groups or bands relying heavily on mobility and quick, efficient hunting. But as the climate changed, people began to settle in areas where food was more reliable and consistent. The first evidence of semi-permanent dwellings begins to emerge during this time. While they still had to move to track game and gather resources, early humans started to develop more complex shelters that could withstand fluctuating weather conditions. These shelters weren't just for protection, they became the center of social life. Historians still debate the shift from nomadic to more settled lifestyles. Some believe that it was the availability of more reliable food sources, like wild grains and abundant small game, that encouraged humans to settle, while others suggest that it was the need for larger, more cooperative social units that drove the shift. One thing is clear, the change in living patterns was directly linked to the social structures that emerged in response to the new climate. The larger and more stable these groups became, the more they relied on each other for survival. Life in these early settlements wasn't easy. While the weather may have been warmer, it was unpredictable. There were still plenty of challenges, droughts, floods, and the constant presence of predators. As communities grew, the need for cooperation and organization became more important. People had to work together to store food, build shelters, defend against wild animals, and care for the young and the elderly. The social bonds that formed during this period were critical to survival. The need for cooperation in a changing world gave rise to early forms of leadership and division of labor. As humans began to rely more on farming and gathering, certain roles became more defined. While hunting was still a vital part of survival, more and more people became involved in gathering, crafting tools, and maintaining the settlements. The early leaders of these groups likely emerged from those who were most knowledgeable about the new world around them, those who understood the changing weather patterns, the migration of animals, and the cycles of plant growth. It's likely that these leaders weren't always the strongest or most aggressive. Rather, they were the ones who could adapt to the new world and keep the group safe. These leaders didn't just manage resources, they also managed the relationships within the group. Social dynamics became more complex, with growing divisions between those who contributed in different ways. Men who were skilled hunters or warriors likely held a certain amount of influence, while women who excelled at gathering, crafting, or cooking would have developed important roles as well. The sharing of knowledge about the land, about food, about survival was passed down through generations, and it helped create a strong bond between people that would carry them through the challenges of the warming world. As these social changes unfolded, something else was happening too. The early human groups that survived the ice melt were starting to leave behind their nomadic ways. With warmer climates, larger territories, and more abundant food sources, the necessity for movement was less immediate. People began to settle into places where they could stay longer, forming communities that would eventually lead to the rise of early villages and towns. But this shift wasn't without its complications. As people settled into more permanent communities, the demands of maintaining those communities grew. With larger groups came more conflicts, whether over resources, space, or leadership. These conflicts weren't always violent. but the tension between groups that were once independent now had to be managed. The survival of these communities was increasingly tied to the ability to cooperate and share, but it also depended on the ability to resolve conflicts, whether through negotiation, ritual, or force. The social dynamics of the Great Ice Melt shaped the future of humanity. As the environment changed, humans didn't just adapt physically, they adapted socially, learning to live in larger groups and rely on each other more than ever. This transition from a small, mobile band to a more organized society was one of the key factors in human survival during the end of the Ice Age. As early humans adjusted to the new environmental conditions, one of the most remarkable shifts wasn't just about how they hunted or gathered, it was about how they started to think about their place in the world. With the ice melt came an entirely new set of challenges, not just physical but psychological. The land was no longer a cold, familiar tundra, now it was a place of both bounty and danger, filled with unpredictable climates and changing landscapes. And as humans confronted this new world, they also began to rethink how they understood the forces that governed it. In this context, spirituality and religion began to evolve. As the environment shifted dramatically, so too did the way humans interacted with it, and this wasn't just about adapting to the land and animals. Early humans also had to reckon with their role in the grander picture of the world. The rhythms of the seasons, the rise and fall of temperatures, the appearance of new animals, and the disappearance of others, these were not random events. They were seen as signs, forces, or deities at work. The belief that the environment was controlled by powerful spiritual forces became an essential way of making sense of the shifting world around them. Historians still argue whether this shift in spiritual thinking happened gradually over time or as a response to the trauma and uncertainty brought by the end of the Ice Age. Some suggest that early humans developed an animistic worldview where everything in nature, from the rocks to the trees to the animals, had a spirit and purpose. Others argue that this view evolved over time into a more organized system of belief, where gods and deities took on greater importance and rituals became more complex. What is clear, though, is that these changing beliefs had an important role to play in survival. As the landscape shifted, early humans sought ways to maintain control over the unpredictable forces that seemed to govern their world. They turned to rituals and ceremonies designed to appease the spirits, ask for protection, or ensure the success of the hunt. For example, cave paintings, intricate carvings, and other forms of art became not just expressions of creativity, but acts of communication with the spiritual realm. By marking their environment with these symbols, humans may have been attempting to forge a deeper connection with the land itself, claiming it as their own, and ensuring that the spirits would watch over them during the transitions ahead. The role of spirituality during the Great Ice Melt was more than just a coping mechanism. It was also a unifying force for the early human communities. As people began to settle into permanent groups and face new challenges, the need for shared belief systems grew. These belief systems helped to bond the community together. The rituals, stories, and beliefs surrounding nature's cycles and the creatures that lived alongside humans allowed for a collective understanding of how the world worked. The community's shared knowledge, rituals, and spiritual practices were essential to maintaining cohesion in times of change. But these spiritual changes weren't just about seeking divine intervention. The shifting world brought about a deeper reflection on life, death, and the cycles of nature. In a time when survival was no longer as simple as following the old ways, humans began to grapple with the fear of the unknown. The Ice Age had been a world of extremes, cold, barren, and predictable, but the new world they faced was full of uncertainty. The disappearance of the mammoth herds and the changing climate forced them to rethink their place in the world. Were they at the mercy of forces beyond their control, or could they actively shape their destiny? In response to these questions, new myths and rituals began to emerge. The changing landscape might have sparked new stories about gods who controlled the seasons or animals that served as guides for human survival. These myths were not just entertaining. They were essential for maintaining hope and providing a framework for understanding the changing world. Spirituality, in this context, was a way to regain a sense of agency over an unpredictable world. It wasn't just about survival, it was about finding meaning in a time of transformation. These shifts in belief systems and practices laid the groundwork for the complex societies that would emerge in later centuries. By the time humans had fully adapted to the post-Ice Age world, their spiritual beliefs had evolved into systems that shaped the foundation of ancient cultures across the globe. The ability to interpret the world through spirituality helped early humans navigate the uncertainty of their environment, ultimately ensuring that they could not only survive but flourish. But as the environment shifted and these early humans adapted spiritually, what did they do when the very fabric of their survival began to change even further, when they began to turn away from their traditional ways of life and embrace new technologies? As the climate shifted and early humans adapted spiritually, they also began to innovate and evolve in ways that would radically transform their way of life. One of the most significant developments in this transition was the adoption of new technologies, tools, and methods that allowed them to take full advantage of the rapidly changing environment. While survival during the Ice Age had primarily relied on brute strength, stone tools, and the hunting of megafauna, the post-Ice Age world demanded new approaches, and humans were quick to respond. The first major shift in technology came with the refinement of hunting tools. While spears, stone knives, and simple traps had served humans well in the frozen tundra, they needed more advanced and versatile tools to cope with the smaller, faster game that now populated the landscape. The development of the bow and arrow was one of the most revolutionary innovations of the time. The bow allowed humans to hunt more efficiently from a distance, reducing the risk of injury from larger, dangerous animals while also increasing hunting precision. With the introduction of these tools, hunting became a more specialized and skilled task, requiring new levels of strategy and coordination. At the same time, the use of the atlatl, a spear-throwing device, allowed humans to hunt larger animals more effectively by giving them greater reach and force when throwing their spears. This innovation further demonstrated how early humans adapted their methods and tools to meet the demands of the changing environment. These tools gave early humans the ability to hunt more efficiently, but they also marked a fundamental shift in how they interacted with the land. The more advanced tools reflected an increasing understanding of the environment, as humans began to manipulate nature in ways that had never been possible before. But technology wasn't just about hunting. As humans settled into more permanent communities and began to gather food from plants, the need for agricultural tools grew. Simple digging sticks were replaced with more advanced tools like hoes and axes, which helped early farmers manage the land and plant crops with greater efficiency. The ability to cultivate the land was a monumental leap forward, allowing humans to produce a more reliable food supply. This technological development wasn't just about the physical act of farming, it also required a new way of thinking about time, space, and the environment. People began to see the land not just as something to be hunted or gathered from, but as something they could shape and work with to provide for their future. Historians still debate whether agriculture developed gradually or in a series of sudden leaps, but one thing is certain: this shift in technology had a profound impact on social structures. With the advent of farming, early humans no longer needed to constantly roam in search of food. They could settle in one place, build permanent dwellings, and create communities that lasted year after year. This shift laid the foundation for the development of villages, towns, and, eventually, cities. But these new technologies and methods also brought with them new challenges. As people began to rely more on farming, they also became more vulnerable to the whims of the environment. Droughts, floods, and poor harvests became significant threats, and communities began to develop new strategies for dealing with these risks. The rise of agriculture and settlement life also led to the growth of more complex social structures as people began to specialize in different crafts, trade, and other forms of work. Leadership roles emerged as communities grew larger, and with them, new methods of organizing and distributing resources. The technological and social advancements during the Great Ice Melt weren't just about survival, they were about transformation. Early humans were no longer solely focused on subsisting from the land. They were beginning to shape and control the environment in ways that would define the future of civilization. But this progress didn't come without its consequences. The more humans began to manipulate the environment, the more they encountered new problems that required new solutions. These early technological advancements, though necessary, also marked the beginning of a shift away from the simplicity of their previous nomadic lives. So, as early humans embraced these new technologies and settled into the changing world, the question becomes, how did these shifts affect their spiritual lives, their social bonds, and their connection to the environment they had once known so intimately? As humans settled into a new, warmer world and embraced the technologies that allowed them to thrive, something deeper was at play, their relationship with the environment. Once, they had lived in harmony with the land, their survival closely tied to the natural rhythms and the wild world around them. The rise of agriculture and more sophisticated tools marked a shift in how they interacted with the earth. Now, humans weren't just living off the land, they were beginning to change it. They were altering the very fabric of nature, redirecting rivers, planting crops, and hunting more efficiently than ever before. This shift, while necessary for survival, began to challenge the way humans viewed their place in the world. They had always relied on the forces of nature, winds, rain, and animals for survival, but now they were increasingly taking control of these forces. The deep spiritual connection they had once felt with the land began to evolve. While the early humans may have once seen themselves as part of the ecosystem, intertwined with the plants and animals they lived alongside, the rise of agriculture introduced a subtle but profound change in this perception. Humans were no longer just a part of nature. They were beginning to see themselves as stewards of the land, shaping it to their will. Historians still debate how this shift in perspective affected the spiritual beliefs of early humans. Some argue that the increasing control over nature led to a more anthropocentric worldview, where humans placed themselves at the center of the world, with nature as a resource to be managed. Others believe that as humans began to change the land, their spiritual beliefs adapted, incorporating a deeper respect for the earth as something to be worked with rather than controlled. The idea of a sacred earth could have grown from these changes. Humans may have begun to see the land as a living entity that required care and respect, rather than simply something to be exploited. This evolving spirituality likely had a profound impact on the ways early humans related to each other as well. As people began to settle into larger communities, social structures became more complex. No longer were individuals simply focused on survival. Now, there were roles leaders, farmers, craftsmen, hunters, and with those roles came responsibilities not only to oneself, but to the larger community. The need for cooperation became more important than ever, and with it came new forms of leadership, organization, and conflict resolution. In these early communities, leadership was likely shared, but as agriculture took hold and societies grew larger, there was a greater need for individuals to take on distinct roles of leadership. These leaders were not just those who could command respect through strength or experience. They were often individuals who understood how to manage the new, more complex relationships within the community. The people who had mastered agriculture, who understood the rhythms of the seasons, who could keep the peace during times of scarcity, these were the ones who were respected, who were sought for guidance. With leadership roles emerging, the social fabric of these early communities began to shift. The transition from small, egalitarian groups to larger, more complex societies brought with it new tensions. With greater resources came greater inequality. Some individuals or families who controlled the best land or the most abundant food stores became more powerful. This inequality, though subtle at first, set the stage for more formalized social hierarchies and even conflict as the struggle for resources grew more intense. Despite these new tensions, however, early humans continued to rely on one another for survival. Cooperation and mutual respect were still the pillars upon which their societies were built. Even as these early humans took control of the environment, they continued to rely on the community for everything from building shelters to raising children to ensuring the success of the harvest. This continued interdependence, even in the face of growing inequality, showed that the bonds of community remained stronger than the divisions of power. The Great Ice Melt wasn't just about physical survival, it was about transforming the way humans thought about themselves, the land, and each other. As the Earth warmed and the environment changed, so too did human society. The old ways of living had to adapt, but in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the future of civilization. And through all these changes, technological, spiritual, and social, there was one constant: the need to cooperate, to respect the environment, and to maintain a sense of community. These early humans, as they faced the end of the Ice Age and the birth of a new world, learned the greatest lesson of all: survival doesn't just depend on the land, it depends on how we choose to live together in it.